Okay, looks like we're live. So, welcome everybody, and this is Dive into World Building. I'm Juliette Wade, and we were talking for a couple minutes. The reason why we're a couple minutes late here is because we were talking about the impending change of technology, and Brian is here wearing all kinds of hats today, and this is awesome. So it's been so inspiring, Brian, that we were totally going to do a hats hangout, but it's not going to be today. Today's topic is corruption, and basically what I want to get into with the idea of corruption is I want to talk about it sort of on a general level. We can obviously talk about it in real-world contexts in order to sort of help ourselves to understand how to use it in fiction. Basically, we have all kinds of systems in our world. And if you are building a secondary world or working in a, you know, I mean, all kinds of worlds have systems of various types, bureaucratic systems, you know, schools that involve anything that involves the interaction of lots of different people coming together to accomplish a particular goal. And anytime that you have a system, the system can be abused, and that's really what I'm talking about with corruption. So systems have various sorts of problems. So I kind of want to take this on a general level and make sure that we talk about the various types of problems that systems can have, as well as you know, if you happen to be working with a corruption scenario in any of the things that you're writing, by all means, feel free to bring it up. So I'm thinking about schools and bureaucracies. You know, so like anywhere you have a bureaucracy, so you could have it at university, you can have government at any of the number of different levels, that sort of thing.
Judicial systems.
Judicial systems?
Definitely. A term that comes to mind, which I'm not sure is completely applicable, but I find it useful, is normalization of deviance, which I think they came up with it to explain the Challenger disaster, actually. But,
normalization of deviance, you said?
Yeah, just the idea of as something goes wrong repeatedly, it just becomes more of a normal thing.
Yes, repeated problems become normal.
Yeah, so with the Challenger disaster, they were like, well, this technical thing, it's happened a few times. It just seems like a normal thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I think that's very applicable to systems of bureaucracies and how much outside the bounds in various ways you go.
Well, I mean, we do talk about we do talk about the problems that. So who was it that was telling me about this? I think it was Reggie, and I wish she were here. But talking about how certain kinds of behaviors become normalized in certain kinds of contexts. Like, for example, if you have sexual harassment going on in an organization, it can become so common that it becomes normalized, and everybody just expects it.
Yeah.
Right? And so people sort of build it into their concept of how the organization works. And then you have to have somebody disrupt the system in order to disrupt the operation of the system that actually keeps the harassment or whatever problem this is going. So yeah, I mean, systems tend to be sort of self-perpetuating, and so whenever something becomes normal within a system, then it's very difficult to disrupt it. Writing notes over here. Feel free to speak or bring things up.
I think there's like I think what we think of immediately is like how bribable are people.
Yes.
But then there's also
I'll be right back. He has the beard.
Okay.
I'm gonna grab.
loopholes in law
Mm-hmm.
you can exploit, and one of the political ones is just sort of networks of friends in high places.
Nepotism, for example.
Yeah, there's nepotism. There's just like I don't know if you ever watched Boardwalk Empire, like the way some of the bootleggers had politicians in their back pockets for cuts of money and services and things, and but they were like networked. There was they knew multiple senators, they knew multiple people in law enforcement. They and everyone was sort of working for this mutual benefit for themselves, of course, not for anyone else.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's useful to ask what motivates this, right? So, because we have our principles, and principles are great, right? And
principles
so
are also a little flexible. Nepotism now is considered bad, but it was considered perfectly normal. You accuse the Porsches of nepotism, they just look at you and go like, "I'm sorry, I don't understand what the problem is."
Sorry, I had to disappear for a sec because there was pizza.
No, that's fine. Right, and so in fact, like when you have hereditary systems, right? The hereditary thing is perfectly normal, and so the idea that that you would give your son a job or whatever is completely standard, right? Though now it might be considered nepotism. So these standards, like many other types of standards that are socially defined, they change over time.
Yeah. Are we discussing? I'm sorry, because I disappeared. Are we discussing what's considered corruption?
Well, we're considering, yeah, exactly. Like, for example, whether nepotism is considered corruption.
Okay.
So, like, if you help your son to get a job in your organization, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But one of the other things that we look at this point is we talk about conflict of interest, right?
Yeah.
And this goes back to the question of motivation. The motivation for your actions, being for the good of somebody, right? Conflict of interest would then be, well, if your personal motivation in action is somehow in a contrast to the overall organization of overall organization's ostensible goals, right? One thing I did want to mention is that one of the properties of systems like this, like cultures and organizations, is that as we act within the system, we both remake the system and perpetuate the system. So we constantly change and at the same time reinforce it in various ways, which is why things like public discourse and activism disrupt the system and also change it at the same time, right? And why we can talk about silence perpetuating a system, right? Because everybody is part of the system, and every piece of action within that system is actively changing it and perpetuating it, usually at the same time.
Makes sense.
It's a sort of a characteristic of chaotic systems generally, and it's actually a characteristic of language, which is kind of fun to know.
I noticed that kind of tendency before, but I had no idea how to talk about it in language, because people, for example, will get upset about someone wanting to use they/them as a singular pronoun, and I'll be like, language changes. You may not, It may not be standard right now, but it has been in the past, and it could be again.
Yes. So that's a good example, actually. And one of the reasons why it's a good example is it's not just a linguistic example, but it's actually feeds into a functional comprehension of gender and all kinds of elements of our cultural system, too.
Yeah. We tend to, I'm sorry, just real quick because I've been thinking about this. We tend to assume our scientific understanding of gender lines up with the cultural understanding of gender in the Western culture, and it doesn't exactly. I don't know.
Well, I mean, so culture is the thing about this is that I think it's useful to consider chaotic systems in general, because any single event or action within a very large system is going to seem like it doesn't affect the system very much, and yet it is also contributing to it and changing it. So it's interesting. So let's try to see about, let's talk about secondary worlds at this point and say, okay, so what kind of a system might you have, and how would it be corrupted, I guess. I have an example. If you want to jump in with one.
I don't know, because I know I've seen stuff where there's just, people bribing politicians, stories, people jockeying for, like, Senate seats or royal, who's going to get to be emperor, and while everybody tries to play, lay out bribes and whatever to see who gets named emperor. I've seen that for sure.
Yeah. Jockeying for power within a government, for example. Yeah.
It's also interesting to see within religious hierarchies because of the doctrinal implications. You can't change change the way the Pope is elected, for example, without having implications about previous popes and whether they had original sin or something.
So yeah.
Oh, that was still super corrupt. I mean.
Oh yeah, not arguing.
Back in the early days, like they totally, like, even though they walled themselves in, they still found.
Oh yeah.
Like it was completely just bribery.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that in some ways, the more individuals are involved, then the less likely the bad behavior of a single individual is to affect the whole, but it depends on where they're placed within the system, too.
Yeah.
So if you have somebody with a great deal of power within a system, they will have a large influence, and so if they are corrupt, then that causes a very, very big problem, right? If you have a small operator within a large system, that person may not have a great deal of influence. But that person's influence also might be harder to track.
Very true. For those who aren't familiar with, like, as I once was, at all with chaotic systems and chaos theory and such, Bellwether by Connie Willis is a bizarre book because it is a romantic comedy with science, but it's also a good way to learn about this stuff.
Okay. I will write it down.
Yeah. And it's Connie Willis.
The importance the importance of where. The position is, someone at the top of the system being corrupted is an obvious problem, but you were saying that influence that can't be tracked, the little influences of somebody, say, in the bursar's office, or even the guy not making decisions, or the individual not making decisions in accounting, just moving things around, just because of record keeping. We put the numbers where we want them, and we trust that they're the right place. If the person whose name we don't know, whose face we never see, his email address is only at the bottom of the "you haven't filled out your hourly time cards" this month.
Right.
is
And
doing
in
what
fact,
it's supposed to be doing.
I have seen instances of it done really well. Like, for example, in Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries. There was a really interesting episode where there was an instance of somebody doctoring the books, and the question was, well, is this doctoring of the books related to this murder that has occurred, or is it not, right? And who does it affect? The other thing that you just made me think of was the woman who refused to give out marriage licenses to same-sex couples. One person, right, but affecting a large group of people in a very detrimental way, right? And she was sort of the butterfly flapping the wings and creating the hurricane in a sense, because then she suddenly like expanded and was seized upon by people as a sort of political football, right? So a single person's influence doesn't seem like it might be that big, but for the people that they directly affect, it's huge, right? And also that person's influence can be taken up and expanded by other people, right? So I'm going to mention something that I'm working with right now that I don't see being done a lot, and that is you don't see a lot of people explaining where their assassins come from. You know, because like assassin is not a normal job.
What's wrong with assassin societies? I mean,
they come from the Assassin's Guild, of course.
And I mean, they're pretty
of course they do.
But it's a sustainable institution.
Yeah. And Brian, you're making a point that I think is important, and I want to take up in a minute. What did you want to say about? Did you want to say about assassins?
With regard to assassins, no, I was just going to say. I mean, it's clearly a sign of a perfectly healthy society that it actually has an organized way of training people to kill other members of that society. What could be possibly wrong with that?
You do tend to see that more often than you might expect.
It's like there's only ever been, I can probably 2 real-world examples where this has actually happened in all the different cultures in history, as far as I can think of, and even those 2 are highly questionable as to whether they're real guilds of assassins or whatever. It's just, it's not a thing that happens. It's not normal.
So this was something that I was running into when I was trying to figure out where the assassins come from, because I wrote this whole scenario, right, with assassins, and then I was like, okay, but so let's dig a little deeper here, because I always like to dig a little deeper. How does this work? Where do the assassins actually come from? And I think, at least in my scenario, it's not. I mean, it may have started out as something unofficial, where there were just a couple people, but then, you know, the government of Varan being what it is, more people thought, hey, that's kind of a cool idea. I want to be able to access these people, and so they got a little bit more organized. But there's still a shadow organization, and the thing is, you have to ask a couple of questions, right? Number one, how do you actually learn about the existence of this shadow organization, right? I mean, you know, like literally, how do you learn about it? Who tells you that this is possible, right? Because if it's supposed to be secret, there has to be a method.
I'm trying to bridge up what little I know about the original, I think it was Hashashin, the kind of religious group that inspired the word. And I know that they weren't just tied together by let's kill people for money, because eventually you're going to either start getting corrupt by those standards and take over the government because you've killed people for political motivation instead, or you're just going to kill each other for money.
Right.
I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah, Perseverance is very structured because of the caste system, so an assassin's organization would fit right in.
Yeah, well, I mean, so
from what I've been thinking from what you've said.
Sorry, say it again.
Because of the caste system, that to me, I've been thinking about that. It makes me look very sensible. Whereas an organization, or a society, we don't have a formal system where that sort of group makes sense, where that a guild, we don't have a guild system or caste system, not a formal one. So we can giggle about assassins guilds and thieves guilds.
Yeah.
If you're playing video games.
If there's a role there available, then I think people will probably step in to take it, right? The other thing is, so if you want to know about these people, how do you find out about them? And if you want to contact them, is there a specific way that is there a way to contact them? So this is like, find out they're there.
It would have to work either one of two ways, I think. One is kind of a vertical thing where there's some group that everyone knows are assassins, but there's an awful lot of plausible deniability. Like, this is I think in one old video game I played, it was the Basket Weavers Guild. So something a little as a facade than that, but something where everyone knows that at least a few of them will kill people for money.
Right, and you have to have a way to contact them, right?
Yes.
And you also have to have a way to pay them.
Yes. The other way is to have your own assassins. Like every family has an assassin, the horizontal method, so that rather than having a group of assassins, everybody has one of their own, which I think makes more sense.
Yeah, depending.
I don't know. I mean, because there's plenty of real-world places that assassins come from. We've had a number of political assassinations in this country.
Sure.
Their motives have been very different from case to case.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So think about it this way for a second. One of the questions that you have to deal with if you have assassins is assassination something that is untouchable by the law?
Definitely.
Or is it touchable by the law? Right? Because if the rule of law applies, then assassinations are harder and have to be done more secretively, etc. Right? So, one of the things, like, very often in a fantasy scenario, you will see, somebody's gone out and killed somebody else, but there just isn't a really strong rule of law. There are bandits out in the woods, and, if you went out and paid them, they'd kill people for you, and nobody would necessarily be able to stop them, right? Because you don't have really strong rule of law. But what do you do in a case where you do have really strong rule of law and this stuff is not, like, it's not okay? So in the barn example, there is a strong rule of law, and this is not okay, which means that the police are supposed to investigate anytime there's an assassination attempt on somebody.
That's corruption.
Well, exactly, but so where is the corruption? Is the corruption in the police, or is it not?
Is it in whoever issues we can go back to the role. Is it in whoever orders the investigation, whoever issues the warrant, assuming that's an actual role, whoever goes to arrest them? Any of those positions can, either delay or prevent someone from being brought to justice.
Right. So So in a way, what I've been dealing with is how to try to make this whole assassination thing happen in a situation where there might not actually be a lot of plausible collusion between the nobility and the police.
Okay, I'm going to bring up Star Trek Into Darkness, which is kind of risky. I don't know, I enjoyed it. But at the beginning, you don't see a corrupt system so much as you see you see the bad guy having something that someone within that system desperately needs.
Mm-hmm.
Which is to save the life of their kid from an illness.
Okay.
Something they can't get elsewhere. That someone who can be perfectly moral normally, but is torn morally between their duty, in this case to Starfleet, and their duty as a parent.
Right.
And I think that those strong emotional ties, we may not think of them often in terms of corruption. We usually think of the guy who will take a bribe, but this is another important form that may be more versatile as a writing tool in places.
Well, I mean, whoever is working against a system that is generally accepted has to have strong reasons for doing so, because these systems generally have consequences built in that are not pleasant for people who break them.
I guess there would be kind of a relationship, I'm trying to think of the word, if it's inverse or whatever, between how much you're going to be punished for it and what you're willing to do for. Like, take a small bribe, are you going to go to jail? Maybe not.
Mm-hmm.
But, and so you'll take the small bribe. But at that point, money is enough of a motivation. But when the stakes go up, the reason has to be bigger. I don't have a larger point, that's it.
Yeah, so we're back to rewards and punishments, which was actually a topic that we talked about. But I think that's actually interesting, and it is relevant, like what people balance, like what the advantage is to a certain type of behavior and what the disadvantage is. Mm-hmm. But I think in a way that, yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting. So I've mentioned this before, but I do want to give a concrete example. The concrete example that I'm working with in my system with the assassins and whatever is that you can learn about them from other people who have used them in the past or been aware of them in the past. But if you want to contact them, you actually have to go through a second group, because you can't go through your servants because they can keep secrets for you on some level, but they're also a little bit more vulnerable to being asked questions in certain kinds of contexts. And you have to also work out the question of money, because the nobility typically don't use cash, and so you actually have to have merchants involved, merchant caste people involved in the transaction, because those are the people who are going to have a cash, right? And the ability to convert the noble virtual money into cash in such a way that it can be disguised. And so, in fact, they actually have to go and do paper dealers, which turned out to be a funny wrinkle, but that was what the system provided as the optimal route, I guess you would say. And so consequences for what people might be dealing with in their own fantasy worlds, I guess what I'm trying to say is think through the steps, right? If you're trying to get something done that is corrupt and outside a legal system or outside the justice system somehow, then you need to think through the exact steps involved in getting there and think about how to introduce difference from what we might expect. I mean, doing research on the mafia is actually a really good idea, because that's you know, a good place to do some real world research.
Don't get too real.
No.
I'm trying to make a joke. It's not working.
But yeah. So anyway, but like think through the steps, I guess would be my point. because sometimes you can actually introduce little differences. Part of what we're trying to do here is think about ways that are non-standard to get the same job done, because cliche is a bad thing. Right? So thinking through steps is one way to introduce originality and difference in what you're working with.
Mm-hmm.
So
go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, if we have time, I would like to look at, because someone just brought up, and I'm not sure if this is what they meant in the sidebar, but what are the consequences of corruption in a society where you have some sort of magical power that needs something specific going on to work? If the guy who's supposed to get the wolf's bane replaces it with something else, you've got a whole new set of consequences. Or I guess you could make that analogous to medical stuff, but with broader consequences.
Well, I mean, medical stuff does make a good analogy, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this just could have more broad applications, like instead of trying to, cure a cold, the fireball doesn't work. This is like another tool you can use as a writer.
Yeah. Well, there are things that can be taught and things that can't. I mean, you can learn to practice medicine. Okay, not every, in general. I'm not going to say everybody can be a doctor, but you can learn to practice medicine so you can theoretically replace a corrupt practitioner with another one.
Mm-hmm.
A magic user, if magic is innate to an individual, if that isn't something that can be trained, what are you going to do? You're going to have to find a non-corrupt magic magic user to replace.
Or you might not be able to.
Person,
that's a good point.
Or you might not be able to.
That's also, I mean, has like real world, because it's like it's just the question of how replaceable are people.
Right.
You know, it's like how do you get rid of? Okay, in like the history of the United States, we've impeached one president.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we've only gone through that process.
Out of how many, right?
40 something.
I don't know the exact number. I literally don't. But it's
44, I think.
Yeah, but it's like, but out of all that, there's one, and you can't tell me that only one has been corrupt. So it's like, how replaceable are people, and if the people aren't that replaceable, then they're probably a lot harder to get rid of. Same for like senators or the Supreme Court justices.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get rid of one? It's and have you ever had to get rid of one? And it does kind of go a little better at like a state level. I think you can get rid of corrupt prosecutors, and I think it was funny because like just before we moved to Oregon, the governor was forced out, and an interim governor put in. So it was like, whoa, the governor was brought down. So
yeah. And also how do you get rid of corrupt police?
Mm-hmm.
For example, when the police are the people who are supposed to be the enforcers of law, and right, so
who watches the watchman?
Who watches the watchman? Right, that's the question, right? So,
it seems like at some point you just have to have the right person in the right place, and you can't really have a system that ensures that. I'm thinking here of Night Watch by Terry Pratchett, where that's basically what it comes down to in the end, is that the guy in charge has that moral compass. And at some point, you just have to have the right person there, and you can never ensure that. Sorry, I'm rambling.
But I mean, I think it is interesting, and you also have to, you get these cultures that organization internal cultures that accept particular types of behavior.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about civil forfeiture, which and also Black Lives Matter and various kinds of things that go on. And there are ways to bring power to bear on it, but they're not necessarily straightforward, and they're not necessarily easily achievable inside the system.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. How do you change the culture within a system? Yeah.
And how much? I'm not sure if this is relevant, so cut me off if it's not. My mom used to explain to me elections when I was a kid as kind of a way to have a revolution that is built in. And now I'm thinking about how entrenched various aspects of that become. Okay, I'm trying to kind of get my mind map together here. How entrenched do various systems within your mechanism for change become? How corrupt does the actual mechanism designed to allow for renewal of the system become?
Yeah. And actually, this is interesting, and I want to mention something. Yes, gerrymandering, obviously. I think that with these systems, people are going to find ways to use them to their own advantage, and you have to have ways built in to counteract that, because otherwise, systems change over time, right? So they will move in a particular direction, and this will cause problems, and then they'll have to move back in the other direction, that kind of thing. California just had a complete redistricting to get rid of gerrymandering, which I was super happy about. Yeah.
Here's the thing about making sure you have a system that will help you clean up the corruption or corrupt system, that people involved in creating the system have to be willing to acknowledge that people are not 100% unselfish all the time. People are not always 100% thinking about the welfare of other people. And if you can't say people are not good or evil, people are good about some things, people are bad about other things, they are unaware of some things, they're very aware of other things. If you don't acknowledge that humans are basically the built-in weak point for a system, then you're not going to be able to put together a system to counteract that problem. You have to admit that there's a problem, basically, is the short form of that.
But then how much you admit it can become a problem in itself. If you outright say you're allowed to do this much deviance from your paycheck, for example, people are going to start thinking about it differently.
But it's not a matter. I'm not saying that it's a matter of allowing it. I'm saying that you need to acknowledge that it exists.
Right. You need to build in methods to correct the direction of the system.
If you don't acknowledge that people will mess with their time cards, then you have no way of. You're not going to acknowledge that there's a need to fix that, to check for it. It's why you get laws like no whales in your bathtub, because somebody suddenly put a whale in their bathtub, and you suddenly realize that this would happen. If you had known ahead of time that people would keep whales in their bathtub, you could say, no keeping. You could have a broader rule, like no keeping cetaceans in your home. But you rely on the base. That's extreme. You rely on the basic decency. I'm so sorry, Brian. I didn't mean to.
He's sulking now, he says.
Well, actually, I think you're onto something really interesting, Morgan, which is, and it's something that we've seen strained in the U.S. in the last 8 years, which is that at the same time that we have the laws that create our government, we also have these very strong social, coexisting social parameters that of what we might call decency or politeness or just the right way to interact with other people, right? And those are not legally defined. And yet they simultaneously exist and they cooperate with the written down laws. So yeah, well that's relevant, Brian, but we'll get there in a second. So you can think that you have this really great system of laws and that it's doing what it needs to perpetuate good behavior, but if it doesn't also have the sort of assumption of goodwill and the sort of cultural system of good manners also involved with it, then you will also find it going off the rails in certain ways, and maybe you have to add more written down laws in order to correct that, or maybe you have to have a larger discussion about the system of manners.
You kind of can look at the laws as the bones of an organism that has bones.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have the right kind of muscles attached, it doesn't do you any good to have the bones. You've got to have a system that functions together.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always got to be changing because of the cultural changes.
Right. So in the last 8 years in the U.S., what we've seen is that the laws aren't, you know, well, some people are trying to change the laws, obviously, and they are always trying to change the laws, but there's been a certain breakdown in the system of manners and decency that has had a big effect on the way that politics is working in the U.S.
Yeah.
And you know, there are lots of systems. We have lots of, so this is actually one of the things that I find really interesting is that any society has lots of these overlapping systems, and each one of them has rules, but they all interact with each other in complex ways, which is why Barn is so dang complicated. But I think there's so many opportunities when you're working with any kind of, you know, where it's not just 10 people on a planet, right? You know, I mean, even if you just have 10 people on a planet, you have all the ecosystems of the planet that interact with each other. But still, if you're working with very, very few people, you might not have to deal with these kinds of systems. But if you have any kind of governmental system, a large population, people form structures and they form systems automatically. So
I don't get anarchists because I look at them and I'm like, you tear down the government, what do you expect to get built in its place?
Oh, and I was going to say, elections in Australia are much more powerful. There are fewer checks and balances built into the Australian system. Mm-hmm. And so there are advantages there and disadvantages, but one of the things that you see is that if people get really unhappy with a particular person, they vote them out, which you know, which is something that actually quite rarely happens in the U.S. But there, you know, because in the U.S. there are all these various ways of approaching the thing, and it's anyway. I mean, it's really interesting. But if you want to go out and do some research on structures of government and the difference, say, between the American system and the Australian system, that's a very potentially fruitful direction to go.
Something that I always note is that when America trots around the world and imposes democracy in a random country, it never imposes anything that remotely resembles the U.S. democratic system.
Screwed up.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but it also shows that, you know, we can see the flaws in our system, but there's so much going on within that system that we can't correct it. We all know that the Electoral College is a screwed up thing. I mean, it's not even proportional, but people have so many other interests, such as keeping themselves and their party in power or doing this law first.
Well, and I think honestly there's something else going on, which is that when you have a system like the American democracy, the system has to build in the ways that the system will be allowed to change, or you will have France, where we're on the Cinquième République at this point, right? The fifth republic. And so you set up a system, and then people, well, I don't like it, so they toss it out, and they have to complete it, and then they have to start again, right?
The golf didn't want to agree on anything.
So it's helpful to have a system that has mechanisms for change built into it, because that actually adds to the robustness of the system.
I've sort of I would love to see somebody write something where humans themselves have just been taken out of the system and it's all just run by AI or something. And like, what would that? Could that conceivably be this incorruptible?
No.
That's been touched on by Alistair Reynolds in his series. The Democists, they're kind of democratic anarchists. They never actually seem to vote, but what they basically have is a set of AIs that really kind of analyze what you really want, and therefore what would be, the thing that you would vote for if you did vote. And they just all go off and try and, organize behind the scenes. This AI system basically tries to organize on the basis of, what people subconsciously feel or, would do if they bothered to vote. People can just get on with their lives, and the system tries to represent, behind the scenes what these people would, how the society runs best for these people. And it's a toss-up between, well, is it what's best for them, or is it what they want? Because most people don't want what's best for them. At least not consciously. Most people don't. I mean, there's always talk about people voting against their self-interest, and it's usually directed against, why are these poor people voting Republican when they're going to take their benefits away? But plenty of people vote in all directions against their own self-interest for various reasons, and it might be, a positive thing. People might actually vote and say, well, actually, I want to pay more in taxes because I feel that I'm, getting more than my fair share, and I actually want. That's voting against your self-interest, but it may be voting for the interest of society as a whole. So there's a big, big balance to try and be found there.
Yeah. Because corruption is largely, I know I missed a few minutes, occurs when people are using a system in their own self-interest to the extreme detriment of other people's best interest.
Yeah.
So you get to the extreme of Douglas Adams, where the ruler of the universe is the person who lives in a shack all on his own with his cat on a planet that nobody else lives on, and just people come and ask him questions, and he doesn't even know for sure whether they're figments of his imagination, because the universe should be run by the person who least wants to run the entire universe.
Well, there is. I mean, I think that there is that. And this is actually, I'm glad we got here, because the idea that there is somebody, that the person who doesn't want it is the best to do it. I'm not sure. I've seen that a lot. This is why you have so many farm boys becoming kings. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm not sure
that's where Farm Boy becomes king and he's complete crap at it.
Right. I mean, how
becomes his total tyrant, and then the next Farm Boy has to come along and remove him.
Has anyone here read Sherry Tepper's book Sideshow?
No.
It's interesting because what it is it does have the computer. I've been looking this up for like the last 5 minutes. The computer that recommends to the government, who always approves the government's recommendations, what to do. And it's particularly interesting because the whole system on this planet is built on preserving cultures statically. Like, we have to respect everyone's cultural customs, but then it doesn't allow for change in the cultures. And I guess that's not so relevant as I thought. Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Shoot, I had a thought. Oh, the other thing I think that it's important to question is this idea that if you have relationships that help you to achieve powerful things, that those are automatically bad.
Yeah, if you know the right person for the job, it shouldn't, maybe you do know them, maybe they are the right person for the job, and maybe knowing them is an important way to see if they're qualified. If you want to put someone in a position where ethical behavior is important, it may be best to choose from among those you know, at least to some degree, because you've seen them in large and small situations practice that kind of thing.
Right, because, I mean, we don't want to make these decisions out of ignorance, right?
Exactly.
And one of the things, actually, we're running out over time, but we started a little bit late. I hope you guys are cool with it.
Yes. Go all day.
So, a lot of it has to do with the underlying motives for the behavior. So like, for example, let's look at a company giving money to a political candidate. If a company gives money to a political candidate because that candidate is going to support them specifically and it's going to be a bribe, then that's corruption. But if that candidate has policies that are going to set up a structural environment in which the company can thrive, it makes sense for the company to donate money to that candidate, even though there is no specific quid pro quo going on.
And how you define corruption is how far you stretch into that territory.
Right. So these things are always very, you have to take a closer look at the context and the actions, and I mean, this is why we have to be very careful about the way that we operate in this arena, right? So
this is where quantity comes in, and whether or not explicit promises are made.
Right. So.
But there's also, like, how do you prove explicit promises were made? I mean, that's part of the problem.
Oh, it is.
Corruption.
It's a big problem.
Is proving corruption has actually taken place, because these things are done not in any public sphere, but in back rooms and, I want to say parlors, I don't know why.
Well, I mean, I think actually that's where the question of transparency comes in. That's the whole idea of the back room, right?
Right.
And transparency is the idea of exposing the behaviors to examination and judgment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not having to rely on someone accidentally leaving a mic on.
And the other thing I wanted to mention, because this is the way it always is. All my good thoughts come out right at the end of the hour.
Because we get going.
The other thing that I think is really interesting is that if you have a system, let's say that you have a gender bias system, right, where men will tend to have maybe there's no even specific intent here, but men tend to know other men and therefore cast judgment upon those people that they know who happen to be mostly other men and pick out the good ones among those other men, so that the ones that are getting a step up on the ladder happen to be other men, right?
Any given structure of prejudice is built on single individual interactions.
Right. And there may not be an intent to exclude, right? But in the absence of an intent to include, this is what is happening, right? So you have two options if that is going to change. One is that you get some man who is a part of this system to switch over to an active intent to include, right? Which is going to entail specific measures to increase the number of people he knows and start to do more inclusion, right? The other option for changing things is to have people who are not men. I'm not going to say women because that's too exclusionary. People who are not men who have found their way to success on their own terms because of their efforts or the support of men or any of the above, right? Creating their own ladders and helping to bring up people who are not men, right?
Either way, you have to interact with that system to some degree.
So, you have a complex system. You have what I would call ladders that are created that are easy for men to use. And then, and this applies not just to men and women. This can apply to any kind of situation. So, say you're on a planet and you've got A type of people and B type of people. And A type of people find it really easy to climb ladders of friendship and influence. And B type of people don't, right? There are two ways to do it. You can either try to introduce B type of people onto the A ladders in a productive manner, or you can have, at the same time, usually, B type of people making their own ladders. And helping each other out with various types of things on their own terms, and perhaps setting up it's not going to be an unrelated system because that's not how these things work. Everything's interrelated. But a system that has more autonomy from the first system.
A thing that helps, though, is because we talk about change is for the people in power with the easiest way up the ladder, with the hands reaching down, need to, or the people reaching the hands down need to decide that change is not bad, that change won't hurt them, that it's not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Once they decide that change is acceptable, then they can start reaching hands out to people that they don't know so well, or helping to make changes so that they will become, it'll be possible to know these people, and that gets into where it is very complicated, and there are so many little systems that interact.
But it's also self-interest, because once in power, I think your main goal generally is to stay there.
And it can be for a variety of reasons. It can be because you feel you're the best to push a good agenda, but it can also be because you want to stay in power, and usually it's a combination.
Yeah,
right.
So you know...
Even if the power is just, I have the power to pay my bills.
Yeah, exactly.
It's an important power. If I have the power to... And then there's the question is, I have the power to pay for my food and my mortgage and my, the transportation to the job, or is it more, the more you add to that, I have the power to pay my bills, and that includes my yacht club.
And my plane.
And my yacht club payments take precedence over somebody else's mortgage payments or someone else's ability to pay their food. That is where you get a real problem.
Yeah.
But you don't think of it like that. You don't think of my being able to afford X, X, and X means someone else can't afford B, B, and B. People don't think like that. We don't think altruistically. We don't think like that. And any change to the system is going to automatically be a threat, because all of a sudden that means, well, oh my God, maybe I can't afford my jet. What happens then? Oh my God, and then you just cling harder.
Well, so I'm gonna want to bring this to a close here. 11 minutes after the hour. But yes, these are really important questions, and I'm reminded. Che is reminding me of this expression that charity is no substitute for justice, and I think that's a really interesting topic for another day.
Oh, we should do charity at some point too. I don't know if we have or not.
Charity and I would say charity and justice would probably be a really interesting topic. So thank you all for being here. Brian has a daily life that he had to go back to. I was really glad to have him here.
I have no life.
Next week we're meeting on the 25th, which is a Thursday, and we're going to be talking with a guest author, Alvaro Zenos Amaro, who has a book that has just come out, and my brain is not providing me with the name of it. My fault completely, but it's a cool book, and we're going to talk about it. Yay.
Yeah. So, real quick?
Yeah.
More complicated. I'm going to write about rocks from now on. That's my conclusion from this discussion.
Well, but you know what? I love all this complexity. Complexity just makes me
overwhelmed.
But anyway, so that's the plan for this coming week, and then going into September, let's do hats.
Yay! Hats!
For fun.
Oh, so excited for hats.
And go out and promote my Patreon because yay! I love doing this show, and I'm going to make sure that we don't get shut down by this change in technology that Google is handing to us. I will find a way to run this on the Google live streaming site. So that is definitely something I'm going to make sure happens. And I will let you know, I believe it's September 12th is the day when they're shutting down the Hangouts on Air via Google+, Google Hangouts. And so I will make sure that I have ways of getting you guys in. We may have to do a test Hangout in order to accomplish this. But we will not let the show die. Anyway, thank you all for being here, and I'm going to stop the broadcast.